Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another show. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong, and we have a great one for you as the world holds its breath regarding the latest escalations in and around the Ukraine conflict. Before I introduce our special guests, just a quick word. Russia right now is investigating Ukraine's drone attack, which destroyed at least 4 strategic Russian nuclear bombers, according to Western reports. That number could be as high as 40, but Russia rejects this. Now, Putin and Russia, they are right now preparing their response, but the retaliation may be imminent or it could already be happening. Russia has struck Sumy very hard as it pushes to create a buffer zone between itself and Ukraine, and Moscow just laid out its terms for ending the war that signal nothing short of a demand for Ukraine's unconditional surrender. The truth is that Russia's punishing moves are ongoing, and it could get worse as the call to release the Oreshniks grow louder and reach a breaking point. As just as we began streaming, the reports have come out that the Kursk bridge in Crimea has also been targeted. So to break down what is going to happen next, I have an incredible panel with me today. We have Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former U.S. Army Colonel and Chief of Staff for Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson, great to have you back on the show.
Good to be with you, Danny.
We also have first-time guest on this show. I've been following his work for a while on 21st Century Wire. He's the co-founder of that publication. It is Patrick Henningson. Patrick, thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Danny.
And we have the co-founder of Veterans for Intelligence, Professionals for Sanity, and former CIA analyst, Ray McGovern. Ray, it's good to have you back here.
Hi, Danny. Hey, Larry. Hi, Patrick.
Hey, Ray.
Ray.
Great. Well, let us get started. Everybody hit that like button as you come on. That helps boost the stream and YouTube's algorithm. Now, I wanted to ask, maybe I can begin with you, Colonel Wilkerson, about this attack that Ukraine conducted against Russia. Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's number 2, said that, quote, "To all who are waiting for retribution, you need not worry. This is a normal person's quality. Retribution is inevitable." Now that we've had several attacks now on Russia, on Russian territory, the latest being Crimea, the airfields has been the most dramatic and the most controversial. And of course, there were 2 attacks on other bridges in Russian territory, Bryansk region. Talk about what the response could be and what do you find is the significance of all of this as we move into possibly a dangerous phase of this conflict?
Well, Danny, of course, I don't know what the ultimate significance is going to be, but I can speculate, and I can speculate fairly powerfully, I think. First, I would like to back up and say, if it's true, the public reports that this planning has been going on for 18 months, then there is absolutely no doubt, there was no doubt in my mind in the first place, that NATO, read Washington, Britain, France, Germany, the whole complex, was involved with this, but principally the United States, because it's got the assets to do the kinds of things that were done, basically intelligence and satellites. But the second thing I wanted to say about it, and I said yesterday on another podcast, is that just imagine for a moment that someone proximate to the United States, or maybe in a submarine or something like that, proximate to the United States, launched an attack that struck Barstow in Louisiana or Minot and blew up B-52s, or hit Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and blew up B-2s. Imagine what we would do if that occurred, because at least some of us are still steeped in the what I call the doctrine of the Cold War, where we never did these sorts of things. But hitting someone's nuclear strike power, and I think if I remember right about the START treaty, which is still active until February of 26, however moribund it might be, one of the requirements was to keep your bombers like that, B-52s, B-2s, and Russian equivalents, in the open. So that was something that was known, and it was that way for a purpose, not so someone could attack them quite the opposite, and yet we did. And we were planning this for 18 months, if the public information is correct. This is a staggering strategic error, in my view. And Putin would be absolutely justified. I hope he doesn't. I hope he's more prudent than that in coming back with an absolutely resounding attack, which actually could include a nuclear weapon. I don't think it will. I hope and pray that it won't. But that's how stupid this was. And I'm going to watch this unfold with some trepidation, no question about it.
Yeah, Patrick, I want to get you in here. The reports are from CNN that Pete Hegseth was getting live as it was happening intelligence on this. And so your response to how Russia is reacting to this, as well as the U.S.'s role and what this reflects about this conflict.
Well, thanks, Danny. I mean, for starters, I expect Russia's response to be very measured and reciprocal in a certain way in terms of the damage that it incurred, what it's going to inflict on Ukraine. Russia's well aware that the West's strategy is basically predicated on a NATO Article 5 tripwire. And so they're obviously going to be very careful about overreacting because they know this is part of the West's strategy. And but at some point, Russia could reserve, not now, but down the road, to call this bluff, basically, because now you're getting into very dicey territory. And if you remember, just 12 months ago, around the same time as this week, last May in 2024, Ukraine launched attacks on Russia's long-range nuclear early warning radar system in Orsk, just on the, I think, the western border of Kazakhstan, that area, about 1,500 kilometers, I believe, from Ukraine. So that was deep into Russian territory. And that was kind of an interesting kind of attack because it's right before this Switzerland peace summit that Zelensky had staged. Obviously, there's going to be nothing happening there when something like that precedes the scheduled negotiations. Same exact situation here. This basically kills any chance of goodwill at the Istanbul summit. So, but yet Russia proceeds by the book, as you'd expect, and they've laid out their demands, obviously political first, then technical talks of ceasefire and things like that. And that's the way it should be. And that's what's missing, I think, from the U.S. dialogue is there's no willingness by the United States to address the overarching political concerns. And then that's also part of the national security concerns of Russia. And until that's done, everything else is secondary. And it's not going to, you're not even going to make it to second base until you deal with those things, which are very similar to what the United States presented the last administration and the last Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and the State Department during December of, I believe, 2021. And then after that, subsequently, more or less the same by Russia. So it's not as if there's any surprises here from that side. What we do have, though, is lots of surprises from the United States side, from the Ukrainian side, and also from the NATO side. A lot of moving of the goalposts, a lot of flip-flopping, and then a continuation of these provocations, which are hugely counterproductive. And I think they're designed to be counterproductive because my personal opinion is, and if the U.S. backs off, and we can talk more about the political dimension of this, the U.S. can't just say, oh, we're going to back off and wipe our hands of this if, the Europeans or the Ukrainians or the Russians and Ukrainians don't get along or whatever. We're just going to, as J.D. Vance says, we're going to pull away from it. I think that's a massive mistake. I think it's a cop-out. I think it shows the United States is weak. Is no longer considered to be a responsible world power. They have to be involved. They need to broker a deal with Russia first, and then those demands need to be impressed upon Ukraine. This is the only way that we're going to avoid potential World War III here.
Ray, I want to bring you in. Your take. Oh, you're muted.
Said
Sorry.
about the, whoops.
No, continue. You're fine.
I'm okay. Patrick said that the first deal has to be between the United States and Russia. There is a deal. There is an understanding. They both see merit in tamping down this thing and finally ending it. That's the big backdrop here of all this discussion. Now, the analogy between what would happen if they did it to us, it's valid, but it only goes so far, because we have our leader as a kind of overcharged, emotionally unpredictable leader who probably would lash out. It's not the same on the other side. Putin is cool hand Luke. I mean, hello. This is all to provoke him into what the British say is a wrong footing Putin. In other words, they do this, the timing I mean now, they do this right before the negotiations, the second round, begin in Istanbul. And I dare say they were hoping that Putin would be overly charged emotionally, like people in the West, and say, well, I don't want negotiations. That's it. We're going to send arithmetics. And that way the U.S. would be kind of blackmailed into, well, caving in or supporting these idiot Europeans that think they can win against a much stronger Russia. One of the saving graces I saw here was that there are the negotiations. That's a biggie. And there are high-level contacts between American and Russian officials. Now, what happened? Well, I saw in the New York Times that it was at the Russian initiative that Lavrov and Rubio talked about this, okay? And Lavrov, in other words, caused the telephone call. That's new. Now, what we know about that readout, so far as I can see, is that Rubio already knew about the sabotage of those two bridges. And he said, my condolences, so to speak. I don't think that's right. Really, you expressed my sympathy on that. Whether, I haven't looked at the timing yet, whether Rubio already knew about these deep penetration strikes by drones into Russia, well, maybe he did, but I don't think he was ready to respond to that. The readout, such as we have, doesn't indicate he said anything about that. So I'm sure Lavrov braced him on that. But the idea is that Rubio and Lavrov were talking, whether, as I suggested in a tweet, that actually Trump and Putin needed to talk before Putin started to become emotionally overcharged, okay? Anyhow, what happened at the foreign minister level did happen. And I think that the negotiations actually have been successful to the point where they've started out with little baby steps. Well, 6,000 frozen Ukrainian corpses taken out of deep freeze and given back to Ukraine for decent burial. These things may not seem much to us, but I think they mean a lot to the Ukrainians. They are goodwill gestures. And, these are minor compared with the major concessions that will be necessary, given that the Russians are winning and not going to settle for much less. Given the negotiations going on, given the high level of contacts, I take some solace in the notion that although there are hotheads that want this thing to go out of control, cool hand Luke in Moscow is going to prevent that by not being provoked.
Colonel Wilkerson, I want to bring you back in here and ask you about how this might backfire on Ukraine when it's all said and done, because all of the Western mainstream media reports are saying that this was about leverage on Russia. And we've heard this over and over and over again, that these terror attacks, whether it's Crimea, whether it's these drone attacks, the most significant one now being this airfield strike, that it's all about getting Russia to the table and essentially capitulating. But how might this actually backfire on Ukraine as this conflict reaches a new stage, or maybe a different stage moving forward?
Well, let me say I don't share Ray's sanguine opinion about this at all. Let me say that I suspect this is going to go on and on and on and on. And what I'm hearing from Istanbul is that that is a prospect of it going on and on and on, because they're not even close. And Ukraine is not going to come around to the adamant position that the Russians have. And saying that the United States, in its current state of disarray, and I do mean that, disarray, is going to be a mediator of consequence in this, even though the situation might demand that, and I think that's true, it does, is nonsense. There's no way this president vacillating from one pole to the other with a cabinet that clearly doesn't know where he's going from one day to the next, with an intelligence community that apparently doesn't even respond to his wishes, and an intelligence community that apparently doesn't speak to anyone but J.D. Vance. And one has to wonder if J.D. Vance is the right conduit for giving Trump, or even if Trump allows him to give him a recent, decent picture of what's happening in various places, including Gaza and the Middle East in general, and including Russia and Ukraine. So I'm not at all happy or hopeful about this situation. I could see this going on and Russia tolerating it's going on because it can't do anything else but let it go on and continue to win for months. And the disarray of the empires were continuing as it is now, and maybe even deepening and becoming more profound. And let me add the disarray of the EU and the disarray of NATO too. We have so many leaders in NATO now, even in crucial countries like Germany and France, and I would say England too, that aren't supported by their people. They do not have a majority of their people who are in their coalition, as it were, or supporting them. So they're short-termers in many respects. And figuring out where the EU is going and where NATO is going is not very difficult, down the tubes. And if I were to say as a military professional what Putin's real objectives were, say 15 years ago, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, I'd place them in three categories. One, to destroy the transatlantic link. Two, to get rid of NATO. And three, to keep his reasonably sound energy hegemony over Western Europe. Maybe the third one being unaccomplishable, but nonetheless maybe a product of the first two. He's going right down that list. And he's being successful, but he's not being successful because of his strategic skills so much as because our lack thereof and because our mistakes. That's why he's winning. And that's the thing that bothers me, the bigger picture that's occurring right now.
Yeah, Patrick, how about you weigh in here? Because, I think the reaction to this, is on one hand speculative, but on the other, there are many who have been clamoring that Putin do more, that he's not doing enough in response to all of this. I'm guessing, what's your take given what you've heard both Ray and Colonel Wilkerson outline here?
I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic. Always optimistic. You can't be engaged in any diplomacy unless you're optimistic. You have to be an optimist at heart. So on that side, I share Ray's sentiments that regardless of how bad this looks like in terms of a geopolitical, diplomatic, foreign policy train wreck, they're talking to each other, and we have to hope that that's overall a positive thing. And they're talking to each other. The Americans and the Russians have a line of communication. The Washington and the Iranians, Washington and Hamas, but specifically on the Russia-Ukraine situation. This is perhaps the most volatile now this week. So by that token, I share Larry Wilkinson's concern just about the overarching, what I think is a huge mistake that's being made by the Trump administration. I think part of it's incompetence, but a lot of it is just a lack of understanding and a lack of appreciation, because I'll be generous that Donald Trump has the right ideas. He has the right intentions. He wants peace, but I don't believe that he has the personnel to pull off the type of high wire act, multiple plate spinning, three different major geopolitical flashpoints. I don't think he has the people who have the skill set nor do they have the subject area experts to pull off any of these negotiations. Hence, they're all fumbling. If you look at Russia, Ukraine, it's materially worse right now. Diplomatically, potential for, they just hit, the Russia's nuclear long-range deterrent. I mean, this is bad. We're at DEFCON. We're going up the scale towards DEFCON 1. And in Gaza, it's materially worse since Trump came into office. And then Iran, we have threats of attacking Iran preemptively that are still getting purchase in Israel and in Washington. So this isn't good. So they're potentially fumbling all three major negotiations. I can't think of a bigger disaster. And it's not as if there aren't competent, skilled people available in the Beltway that can help to advise, including our present company on this panel, Colonel Wilkerson and Ray McGovern, who are subject area experts, and they're one or two of many who could fill that role, and they're not doing it. Instead, he's pared down his team. He doesn't have the type of complement. He's sending a private envoy, which I think is completely unprofessional and unrealistic, that Steve Witkoff himself is going to garner any results. Marco Rubio is not really involved in the way that previous Secretary of States are involved. So this hierarchical system that Trump has constructed, I think, is a disaster. Not only that, I think the rhetoric that this is not my war, this is Biden's war, that works politically for a while. But you can't just pretend to be aloof and say, and at the same say this would never have happened if I was president, and then this week saying I wasn't in the loop, I didn't know about the assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin, and I didn't know about this drone strike. You can't. It did happen under your watch, Donald Trump. You are president, and the war is happening. So that old shtick is just completely getting old. And then this backing off, if they can't make a deal, we're just going to wash our hands of this. The U.S. is shirking its duty as a nuclear power, as a UN Security Council member. They have they're duty bound. They have an obligation to the international community to play that role, responsible role, to tamp down tensions. That's been traditionally the role of previous administrations. Instead, they're really careening in the opposite direction. And this is a problem. Is it because this administration doesn't appreciate what's at stake? Do they not appreciate previous administrations and the types of people who played those roles before and what could be learned from them? You have to remember, even Ronald Reagan could call Richard Nixon for counsel if he needed. And I'm sure Ray has plenty of stories from his career where previous administrations were called in to give opinions and direction and counsel and help. I don't see them drawing from that type of intelligence pool in this administration, and that frightens me. I see the opposite happening. I see them basically burying their head, closing ranks, and taking this kind of tortoise position half the time with the media, and it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence, quite frankly.
Yeah, Ray, anything you want to respond to both Colonel Wilkerson and Patrick here?
That we have two area subject experts and / diplomats right on this program with you and me, Danny. These are the kinds of people that should be available for counsel and advice. Now, we're doing our best by talking to folks like you, Danny, but we're not getting much headway, at least not yet. Now, there's no denying the fact that there's chaos and that Trump is unpredictable and that he's bitten off a lot more than he can chew. He's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for God's sake. On Gaza, it is unconscionable that we will continue to support, to enable genocide. So let's, if we can, at least intellectually, put Gaza and China and the rest of the Middle East actually at one side and say, okay, what about Ukraine? On Ukraine, for whatever reason, his instincts are good, as Patrick suggested, and so are Putin's. Putin's instincts are, well, wow, this is a window of opportunity. This fellow Trump really seems to want to do some kind of deal. I've explained to him how hard it's going to be, and he wants to do it anyway, okay? Witkoff, in that respect, has played a useful role. So there's chaos. I've never seen the government in such disarray, but to the degree that Trump is in control, and that's an essential question, he and Woodcock can bring this off. Now, with respect, made another, one thing that Larry suggested about if we, the United States, tried to be a mediator of consequence. I don't see that as our role, and more important, of course, I don't think that that Trump sees that as our role. His role was to get the Russians and the Ukrainians together, and he and Putin worked out just 3 weeks ago very clever ways to doing precisely that. And now the Russians and the Ukrainians have talked twice. Now, will this go on and on and on? Yeah, but that's a good thing. It's better to jaw than war, as Winston Churchill says. Now, that's an imperfect analogy because there is war while jaw is going on. But what's the war about? The war is about Russia, how much it's going to win and how much it might be prepared for some kind of compromises to get its core interests, as it says, honored and agreed to. So this is going to take a long time, and it may never come to fruition, these negotiations. But meanwhile, Russia is taking over as much of Ukraine as it thinks it needs to have this buffer zone, so-called by Putin, so that in the final analysis, the Ukrainians, what's left of Ukraine, can't do damage to Russia. Now, with these drones and stuff like that's going to be a very artful inspection regime or treaty or whatever it is. But, we used to, just to finish up, we used to use this word, недоговороспособный. Договор is agreement. Sposobny is able to, okay? So you're not able to make an agreement. That was what the Russians were calling the US, and that's what the US was calling the Russians, okay? But now, wow, they're getting together. That is, the Ukrainians and the Russians are getting together, and the Ukrainians seem to be договороспособность all of a sudden, and the Russians are willing to make concessions. I'm pretty sure they are. They don't want to be burdened with a whole Ukraine under their tutelage. They don't want another Vietnam for themselves. So there's room there. It's just that, what was the word? On and on and on and on. Well, I see that as a good thing because I see it as a safety valve to have some prospect that there could be progress in a more peaceful way rather than slugging it out with Oreshniks and other things in Ukraine.
Yeah, Colonel Wilkerson, I wanted to definitely, you can feel free to respond to this, but I wanted to ask you about your reaction to, Vladimir Putin and Russia came out with their terms for ending the conflict. A lot of this drone attack, this bridge attacks, all of this comes in the context of the Istanbul talks. And I just want to show you how the Western mainstream media has been framing it. This is from NBC News. Putin's demands to Ukraine underscore a position the West always suspected: no compromise. The memorandum was less of a peace plan and more of a demand for Ukraine to surrender, defanging its military, and become a vassal of Moscow. Now, I also want to play you Lindsey Graham, because as much as I don't agree of this narrative that Trump is not in the know, that Trump is somehow not a party and everyone else is kind of doing this Ukraine policy for him, at the same time, you have people like Lindsey Graham who very explicitly comment on this matter. Here is what he had to say during his surprise visit to Kiev just days before the Istanbul talks and all of these attacks.
President Trump said that Ukraine doesn't have good cards. Well, Russia's much bigger and has a lot more people. I get that. But the world has a lot of cards against Russia. And one of those cards that we have is about to be played in the United States Senate. In America, you have more than one person at the card table. We have 3 branches of government, and the House and the Senate are poised to act. what would change our mind if Russia came to the table, agreed to a ceasefire?
So, Colonel Wilkerson, your thoughts and reaction to all of this?
Well, when I see Lindsey Graham, I want to throw up, generally speaking. And he's from my home state. I'm going to back every penny I have left in my bank account behind the woman who's running against him, because she is really something. As my father said, Lindsey Graham is a jerk, and I'm not giving him another penny. He's a lying sack of all right before he died. That was on his deathbed. He really fell out with Lindsey. And he lived right down the street from him in Cross Creek Plantation, at least one of Lindsey's houses at that time. But he's a jerk. And I don't take anything he says for gospel, except I take it for his pronouncements on the empire. An empire, by the way, Lindsey probably hadn't looked at the bond market lately, but an empire that is rapidly going down the tubes. If you look at the bond, the Japanese just said, sorry, don't want any more, certainly don't want any more 30 years, and probably don't want any more 2-year bonds. And American citizens are saying that now too. So we're headed for a tremendous fall. And Lindsey's expostulation there, as it was conceived in his mind, that we are so big and so powerful and that we have lots of levers we can pull and just bring Moscow to its knees, is absolutely ludicrous. And Lindsey's going to find that out over the next 18 to 24 months. I feel sorry, and I didn't say I think I'd ever say that, for the Senate of the United States when they have to deal with what's coming. That said, I don't think Russia is falling off of a single parameter that we've known for some time now. And I don't think they're about to fall off a single parameter, because they have, through blood and treasure, won. That's the way wars work. You know, check your Clausewitz. That's the way they work. One side wins and another side loses, or you have a draw and a bigger power comes in. You know, there are all kinds of permutations. But in this case, one side has won and the other side has lost. Now, because this isn't really a war between Ukraine and Moscow, and it's really a war between the United States of America and its vassal states in Europe, who are rapidly becoming non-vassal, and Russia, it's a different dimension. So the fact that Donald Trump has to participate in this is a prime requisite, because the war is really between him, despite his denials thereof, and Putin, or Russia and the United States, with NATO as an appendage and Ukraine as the bloodied, really bloodied proxy. This will go on forever because we want it to, and Russia isn't going to give up. I don't care how long we talk or how many cities we talk in. That's the reality of this situation. And it's going to be very difficult to change that reality unless someone says uncle. And I don't see Donald Trump saying uncle. He's the art of the deal man. And he's got to come out of anything that happens that he participates in, even if it's mainly at the top, if you will, geostrategic, geopolitical top, US, Russia, and better relations. Those are soured so badly now that I'm not even sure they can be achieved. But even if they were achievable and that were what he concentrated on, the bottom's going to eat his lunch. So I'm not sanguine about this at all.
Yeah, Patrick, definitely come in here. Any reactions?
Well, one of the big problems with this administration is fundamental problem. It's not just with this administration. It's, I would say, for the previous administration as well. I almost appreciate the Obama administration on as big of a critic as I was about so many of the new wars that were started and so forth. There was at least some logical, you could follow some line of thought, but you can't hear. The problem is you see, because if all of your ideas and your beliefs and assumptions about the parties that you're dealing with in the international system, like Russia, for instance, okay, if they're all based on erroneous talking points that are on heavy rotation on Fox News, like Putin wants to conquer the whole of Europe, and Zelensky repeats it in his speeches. He said that we're holding the line here at Ukraine, but we're also holding it for the whole of Europe, and we're going to force Russia to the negotiation table. And I just hear the exact same talking points on CNN, and I hear the same talking points in the Trump administration ultimately when they're having the conversations there through their various actors and cabinet members and so forth and surrogates. If that's the case, there's no way that you can have a kind of coherent policy, that it's doomed to fail. Every single policy direction that you take will not succeed. If your idea about what's going on and who you're dealing with is completely false and sort of based on circular reasoning and propaganda, and that's kind of where the United States is right now. This is where Washington is right now. It was bad under the Biden administration. It's potentially worse under the Trump administration. And if we talk about the Middle East, it gets even more erroneous, the assumptions and the ideas and things like that. So there's that problem. That's a fundamental problem. But the other thing is, and I don't mean to sound like overly dramatic with history, but for the U.S. not to take a central role, obviously you have to be responsible, well-informed, and able to be competent in negotiations and diplomacy. But there's a big danger by the U.S. receding because other things can fill the vacuum. Okay, there are other European actors that have actually been playing the role of chief whip in NATO. I'm talking about Britain as an example. Okay, the rhetoric is much more strident. It has been for the whole conflict coming out of London, from Boris Johnson right now to Keir Starmer. And so Britain has a very different agenda, you could say, probably even than the United States. I know they've worked together like a hand in glove for a long time, but they're giving Britain and maybe some other dangerous actors and maybe slightly more ideologically driven like Poland in terms of their historical relationship with Russia. And these are the things that you want to avoid, because if the U.S. pulls back, then they will eventually be pulled back in. And history has shown the United States being pulled into two major wars in the last century, twice. And then to marshal the rebuilding of the disaster. And do we want a repeat of that, or can we do things to prevent that from happening? And I don't believe in coincidences. And the START, I think Colonel Wilkerson or Ray mentioned the START Treaty. This attack this week is very significant because more than anything, it's a war that was declared on the START Treaty. Okay, all of these agreements are lapsed. The ABM, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and now the START Treaty. So this was, I think, a very calculated provocation, and I don't think it came from Kiev. I think this came from a NATO country, possibly Britain, possibly the U.S. elements within the U.S. intelligence were well aware, provided the ISR for these attacks, I'm sure, but some plausible deniability because the United States may have been, hands off on the actual operation. But think about that. No coincidence there that starts up for review very soon. And they want to have this bundled agreement like with Iran. They want to bundle in this giant all-encompassing agreement. That's not going to happen. So, but we still get these provocations. And you know what? Last week, Britain launched their strategic defense review. And the centerpiece of that, this is no coincidence, was called the Kill Web. It was about drone swarms. And this operation that the Ukrainians mounted with the help of NATO actors was called this Operation Spider's Web. I don't believe in coincidences. I think this was deliberate. This is the future of asymmetric warfare. And as our other panelists said, this can just go on and on and on. And it's hugely dangerous because you have the ability here to threaten governments, to paralyze through constant swarms of these types of attacks, to paralyze governments. And when you're dealing with nuclear powers, at some point, a nuclear power could opt to launch a preemptive strike if they think there's an existential threat in terms of their nuclear deterrence, dealing with nuclear powers. It's a very dangerous area. We cannot proceed down this road. I don't think it's a sane path to gamble. And the talk in London from the MOD and everybody else is, yeah, we need to give Russia a bloody nose. We need to teach them a lesson. Ukraine's going to, get the upper hand now. That's the belief now for the last 3 years. So the U.S. should be moving in to say, we're not doing this. But that's not happening with the Trump administration. That is hugely concerning, plus the rest of Europe. But some world leader, some government needs to step forward and take a leader, because the Trump administration is Donald Trump himself being uninformed about a lot of the nuances of these things and not delegating to, I think, competent subject area experts. I think he's very weak. He's showing himself as being a very weak leader, and is as aloof in many ways as Joe Biden. To take the rhetoric away. And I am hoping for the best, but I'm also being realistic because I'm looking at how this is progressing, and I see it going on a bad arc on all three major flashpoints at the moment. And this needs to be dealt with now, or things could spiral out of control down the road.
Yeah, Ray. I mean, when we're talking about being thankful for Obama, I mean, we're in really bad territory now. I mean, it's just given all the warmongering that happened there. If we're looking at a better train of thought, we have certainly declined quite a bit. But Ray, what does it also say? You react to anything that Patrick just said? What does it also say? Vladimir Putin and Russia have been very firm. This is all about pressuring Russia to capitulate and give up on essentially what it's been demanding for several years plus now, since the very beginning of this thing. And Russia just won't. Putin will not relent, does not capitulate. So what does this all say to you?
Against the background of the wish by both Putin and Trump to have a more decent relationship between the US and Russia. That's the pervasive reality here. They're together on that. They give priority to that. Everything else, in my view, is secondary. And if you buy into my theory, you can understand a lot of the punishment that Putin will not be provoked to react to, and the way Trump keeps supporting Putin, for example, on encouraging the talks in Ukraine. Now, they both have a mutual interest in that, but they also have a mutual interest in allowing each other to back away from Ukraine. Putin has won, as Larry said. Yeah, he's won. But Trump needs some lipstick on the pig of defeat, and Putin, in my view, is flexible enough to give him that. Why? Because he's a nice guy? No, because he doesn't want to take over all of Ukraine, okay? So what about Odessa? What about Kharkov? The notion of Russian forces fighting Ukrainians in Odessa, this beautiful city, and Kharkov is crazy. Putin doesn't want to do that. So there's room for negotiation. Putin said 2.5 years ago at the end of one of these long Q&As that I think only I read the text of, okay? He said, Odessa could be a яблоко раздора. It could be an apple of discord. Think about your mythology, okay? Or it could be a way of getting irreconcilable differences together so we can work really difficult things out. That's what Odessa could be. I think that there's still a prospect. Does Putin want to destroy Ukraine? I don't think so. I think that he'd prefer to have a Ukraine that was viable enough, and it can't be viable enough on its own without access to the sea, and that means Odessa. So there's things to work with here. Now, with respect to the propaganda, to the public thing here, the rhetoric, it's interesting. Biden said several times, do you think that Putin's going to stop Ukraine? Poland, Baltics. Well, it's going to be really easy for Putin to say, look, Donald, this is what we do. I will promise you that I will not try to take over Ukraine. I'll write it down, nor Poland, nor the Baltics. I'll promise that. And you can advertise that to the American brainwashed public as you got me to agree to that. Now, what the American public doesn't know, and this is key, all right? The Russians stopped. They stopped in March, 6 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, because they scared the pants off Zelensky, and he picked his best friend to negotiate with them, and they had initial negotiation. Now it's going to be much tougher. But I don't think the Russians want more than what they already have. They have the power to insist on it. It's on the fringes here. And again, against the background of this overweening desire, which I can't really explain very well, but I know it's there, of both sides to create a more decent relationship one with the other, Russia, US détente, or even rapprochement. I think that can be explained to the American people in a gradual way, and that's why as these talks go on and on and on and on, that's a good thing. We can have them go on. The Russians will continue to progress, and their hands will get stronger. And finally, Trump will realize, well, what will Putin give me in terms of this lipstick I need to put on this proverbial pig?
Colonel Wilkerson, though, one thing I wanted to ask you, given what Ray just put out there, is we know that the CIA, we know that U.S. intelligence, UK intelligence, so we know that they're actively involved in helping Ukraine with these kind of operations, like what we saw with so-called Operation Spiderweb and all these attacks on Russian territory. Won't eventually, if this goes on and on and on and on, won't eventually this lead to a kind of attack, or could lead to a kind of attack that Russia cannot hold back on, that it will be compelled to respond in a massive way? And I think that's one of the dangers I see of this going on and on and on. Your take?
Well, as Clausewitz points out very clearly, particularly in Book 8, you never know when that moment is going to arrive once you've let slip the dogs of war. You never know. And the deeper you get into it, the greater your ignorance grows. And let me say a point about Odessa. If you've read any Alan Furse, a better historian than most historians, you know that Odessa is a criminal city, basically. Beautiful people, yeah, but mafia-like existence. And I don't think, as Ray said, Putin would want it. I know his naval commanders probably salivate over it, because if they had it, they then would have 3 major ports on the northern rim of the Black Sea, and they would make our venturing into that sea very dicey. So in terms of strategic interest, if I were a sailor, I definitely would want to complete my coup d'etat, if you will, with regard to the Black Sea with Odessa. But I wouldn't want the problems that Odessa would bring, for the very reasons that Alan Furse points out vividly in almost every one of his books in one way or another. So I agree with Ray that I don't think Putin wants the problem of partisans who, from World War II alone, if not earlier, are some of the worst in the world in terms of killing everything, men, women, children, taking your gold teeth and so forth. That's what he would get if he tried to invest all of Ukraine, not to mention others that might participate from across the border, as it were. So I agree that he doesn't want the whole thing, but he may be compelled to take more than even he wants, because he can't just, I don't think, stop and let himself be piecemealed to death with things like just happened and other things that might happen right near the front that is thus created. So he's got a problem there. The inexorable movement of his forces is something that generals would tell him, we don't want to stop and just defend. We don't want to stop and just vegetate. So this conflict has its own dynamics on the ground that play into the strategic aspects of it. And that's one of the things we're trying to exploit. We're trying to use that very pressure that Putin's under to either do something, stop, defend, whatever. We're trying to use that to further harass him and to further denigrate his forces. That's not a good recipe for the future of that region. And as I pointed out in other venues, if I were the Poles, not the current government, but if I were the Poles, some of whom I know quite well, I would be wondering whether or not I might be able, a year down the road here, and we're still doing this, work out a deal maybe with Moscow, where I would get some of the territory that I covet, and some Poles do intensely still covet it, and maybe give a backdrop to the problem that Putin is now confronted with, and give a sort of a margin of safety for him between real NATO, if it even is still in existence, and I don't think it will be, and his own forces. So there are all kinds of dynamics to this conflict that could play themselves out militarily and otherwise. But I do think the problem we've got right now is, as Patrick said, we don't have any competent people in the United States of America to deal with this problem. And I think it's essential that we do deal with it. It's just the nature of the beast, if you will, that we have to deal with it. And we are not going to do it very competently, and that could deepen the problems.
Yeah, Patrick and then Ray, I would definitely want your final thoughts before we pivot to a different part of the world. Sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, just to round off my thoughts on this particular situation, Danny, you know, it's those in Washington, whether that's J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio or whoever is, you know, pulling together foreign policy, they absolutely have to include Russia in the, you know, some kind of a coherent, binding European security framework. It has to include Russia. The Europeans and the UK are basically saying Russia's persona non grata for all things Europe. NATO will decide, and so forth. And so the US is in a position to make sure that that goes in the right direction. But they need to also understand how this mechanism works. And, you know, for the longest time, NATO has been the glove in which the U.S. could insert its hand to steer military, political, and economic affairs in Europe. And now we're seeing, with the rise of different types of politics coming, including in the U.S., and different types of thinking in terms of foreign policy management of post-World War II zones like Europe and Japan, for instance, the Pacific, a different type of thinking. But this is also a very dangerous interregnum historically. And at the same time, and if you noticed, those who were paying attention, European collective defense was taking shape before the Ukrainian conflict kind of broke out in the big way in February of 2022. And they had just signed the PESCO agreement. So why was that important? It's not exactly problem-free with Europe, because the problem with Europe is they can never get on the same page foreign policy-wise, because you have a collection of all these different countries. NATO provided this continuity, led by the United States, with Britain as number 2, to decide what foreign policy was going to be for Europe. But those, you can see it eroding now. And I don't think they could get on the same page easily without NATO. So a lot of people in Europe still clinging to NATO. They need the clout of NATO. They need the gravitas of NATO. They need to have this this track outside of their own democratic systems to exert power or to do whatever this new power configuration is going to look like. Because if it's done through Europe, it's going to be completely impossible, and they might just end up subjugating to Asian economic growth and interests, and the fact that the money is in Asia right now. So they're fighting the inevitable in Europe. The United States has to either decide what role they're going to play in this transition into a you could call it a multipolar world or a BRICS-centric political economy globally. And I don't see that kind of clarity. I don't really see any vision or strategy coming out of the U.S. other than, you know, rent-seeking opportunities for the Trump and transactional rent-seeking power plays, like, oh, what are you going to give us? What are you going to provide us? And these trade wars that Trump has declared against the world, it's completely directionless. I don't see any clear policy in anywhere in any of this, as well as U.S. foreign policy, other than, like Ray said, Trump's instincts, wanting to do the right thing and, you know, stop the wars. Okay, that's a good starting point. But there's a whole lot of other essential things that need to happen to get to that point. And this is the real problem. So I really think there's a lack of imagination in Washington of where America's place in the world is in this transition. And it's still calling China our enemy. What has China ever done to the United States? Potentially they're our enemy. They're going to thwart us from our, you know, catbird seat in the global hegemonic position. Ridiculous thinking, but Marco Rubio himself has been parroting this type of rhetoric for years. So is this what these people really think? because I don't think this is going to work going forward for the United States.
Yeah, Ray, jump right in.
Patrick, they're ad hocing it, as we used to say. You ad hoc things, you ad hoc them. You don't have any real vision or policy. However, on Ukraine, there is this backdrop that I've described 2 times now. And the fly in the ointment is the media. It's the military industrial intelligence media complex, okay? What about the media? They're controlled by the rest of the military industrial complex, for God's sake. Look at the multinationals that control the media. Are we chipping away on it? Yes, we are. I think there have been some salutary developments of actually sensible reporting, even in the Financial Times, if you look over the last month. Maybe that's a harbinger of things to come. The real problem is in Germany, where the media is even worse than it is in the United States, if you can believe it. Not quite as bad as Britain, maybe. But German people have been deprived of information that is valid. There's one member of Sarah Wagenknecht's party. Her name is Seven Dagleden. You should put it this way. Unsere erste Pflicht ist, sich von diesem Königreich der Lügen nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, so it's our first duty by this Königreich, by this kingdom of Lügen, of lies, okay, nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, don't let ourselves be made dumb. Now, there are a lot of Germans that realize they've been made dumb, okay? And I see that Merz is probably, ironically, a good catalyst for making them wake up and say, my God, our grandfathers told us about what happened in the 30s. Is this the 30s again? And are we ready to deal with the Russians? My God. So what I see here is a gradual chipping away at things where the media might be formed by more reality. I see Danny, your show, and others as making a huge contribution to this, and Americans being able to be informed. But that seems to be the fly in the ointment that I see that's preventing sensible things from happening. It's not only disarray and incompetence and stupidity in Washington, it's the media, which actually has control of a lot of what Washington policies are. Lastly, there's no one that knows this better than Vladimir Putin, who said expressly, this is a virtual quote, 3 years ago, I realize that American foreign policy is made primarily on domestic political considerations. That's how it's formed. So if the media is telling Americans that Putin has 2 horns and he's worse than Hitler, and that has to stop, I see little chips in that. And I applaud you, Danny, and others who are trying to make it possible for Americans to be educated and nicht dumm machen zu lassen.
Appreciate that very much, Ray. Now, let's move, if we can, to West Asia, because it is just absolutely out of control. And we have to just center here Israel, which has been opening fire on these sham aid venues that have been set up, which the Gray Zone has revealed through just simply scouring Twitter, that Israeli officials have admitted that the Mossad has funded these sham aid centers and essentially have been drawing Palestinians in, walking miles and miles and miles, and then opening fire and killing. Now, the reports say 20 plus, but we know it's a lot more. But the situation, maybe we can start with you, Patrick. The situation, of course, is very dire, not only for the people of Palestine, but we know that Israel right now appears to be digging itself into a huge protracted quagmire where it is demanding that it be able to strike Iran. It is in a protracted conflict with Yemen. And even just as we speak here, We know that the Palestinian resistance has inflicted blows again, that they are fighting very hard to defend themselves from this genocidal onslaught. So, Patrick, how about you give us the lay of the land of this situation? I know that you cover it deeply first before we move to the others.
Sure. Yeah. First thing I'll say is where this situation is right now in Gaza is terminal right now. It's really it's worse than anything you could even possibly have imagined a year ago. It's really, really horrible what's happening, and you have to get past the rhetoric. And this is where I've been a huge critic of the Trump administration, especially Steve Witkoff himself, because again, I'm looking at I'm not interested in the rhetoric, and talk is cheap, especially in foreign policy discussions. And the material reality on the ground in Gaza is fundamentally much worse than it was when Trump took office. Okay, and this is a president that has considerable, you could say, ties with Israel, and hopefully some positive influence in somehow tampering down the Netanyahu's genocidal proclivities on this. But what we've seen is a lot of, I think, pseudo negotiations. The ceasefire looked amazing when Trump came in, and it was a huge breath. It gave respite to the people that were being besieged in Gaza, and it was a great thing. But in hindsight, it looks like it was merely a pause to give Israel time to rearm by the United States and its allies, and then also to restaff its ranks of the IDF that were quite clearly demoralized after the previous 12 months. So if that's all it was a strategic pause, and it wouldn't be the first time the United States would be involved in such a deception, okay? So if that's all it was, then that's all for naught, and that was a show. So what has Israel always done in negotiations? Let's be realistic. They're good at buying time. They're good at buying time to change the facts on the ground. And that's exactly what's going on now. Now you have the worst possible situation. Is that by demonizing UNRWA, the United Nations work and relief agency, by equating them with being a terrorist organization, and the UN pretty much took that sitting down, by the way.
Yeah.
Except for their special rapporteur for human rights and Palestine, Francesca Albanese, is the only high-profile person I really, to me, pushed back publicly. The Secretary General did almost nothing in hindsight. So what they've done is tried to override, tried to demonize, neutralize, ultimately shut down and destroy UNRWA that's been providing aid since the mid-1950s to Palestine. They don't just provide aid, they do education, they do counseling, they do all sorts of essential services. And they're the conduit with 300 or 400 small kitchens around the Gaza Strip to effectively and efficiently feed the population, okay? So by cutting off aid and imposing a blockade, with the U.S. and Israel have done that jointly, okay? You can't just put all this on Israel. The United States has done this jointly with the Israelis, okay? By doing this, the floating pier stunt, and now the worst, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so-called. And what they've done is by neutralizing the supply of food from UNRWA and then creating their own bottlenecks. And they're doing these what can only be described as feeding points, okay? 4 or 5 feeding points that are quite clearly designed to push people to the south, okay? Ultimately push them into either kill zones or concentration camps, and ultimately push them out through Rafah into the Sinai Desert, or kill them on the spot. I mean, that's kind of what it looks like on paper. And the United States is kind of shepherding this process, pretending it's not happening. But that's exactly what's happening. They've made Gaza unlivable. And they've created a situation where people have to make hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people might, at some point, if whoever survives is going to have to make the choice, do I make a run for it and save my life and my family's life, or whoever's left, or do I stand my ground and die here? because that's what the Israelis have been pushing for. They believe in Israel, based on the political rhetoric across more or less most of the spectrum, that they've almost finished the job with Gaza. And let's be realistic about it. And I don't think there's any nice way to put. We are looking at the worst possible humanitarian holocaust of our time. Okay, it's happening now, and now you're starting to see some European leaders and some people in the media finally doing the responsible thing and describing what is actually happening rather than covering it up. But it's almost like, can Israel be stopped pushing that final domino down with the Palestinians being crushed underneath it? Is that possible now? I'm not sure. And I'm not very encouraged by what I'm seeing from the Gulf either, although it's been good that Saudi Arabia has put conditions on normalization with Israel, so much as, Israel must make some substantial moves towards the formation of a Palestinian state. At least there's that. But I don't see anyone intervening to save lives in Gaza from the Middle East or Egypt or the Gulf. And I don't see the U.S. doing it, and I don't see Europe doing it. So who's going to do it?
Colonel Wilkerson, I want to get you in here. You very frankly talk about the atrocities and what Israel is doing. What do you make of this situation? And can this go on in perpetuity? Because that is essentially what it seems like Netanyahu and the Israeli government, and of course the United States, which has done very little to put an end to this. But if it does, I mean, what are the consequences here, both for the people of the region and maybe Israel itself?
First, let me say I associate myself positively with every word, comma, semicolon, colon, and period that Patrick just uttered. This is a deplorable situation. In my 80 years plus on this earth, 50 of them in government service, I have to say I've never seen anything like it, nor did I think as a citizen of this country I would. That said, I think we've taken the wraps off one thing. To a certain extent, Mearsheimer and Walt, with their Israel lobby, did a disservice. They're right in terms of buying Congress, in terms of Netanyahu in particular's control over the Congress. We've seen vivid examples of that. He actually called me and other military veterans who are on the congressional lawn, as it were. He actually called us doomkoffs for Iran. I'd like to have walked into the well of the joint session there and, put a smack on his head. But that's how bad the situation is. And in that sense, Walt and Mearsheimer were right. But they're deadly wrong about the ultimate situation. Israel is our pit bull in the Levant. We, as Lindsey Graham said clearly on the Senate floor more than once, but one time I remember vividly, I can quote him verbatim. If they weren't doing it, we'd have to be there doing it. He believes that. Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and a host of other of my political party's members, and lots of Democrats too, believe that also. That if Israel were not doing what it's doing in Gaza, we would have to somehow do it. And so it's really okay that they're doing it for us. And would you please hurry up and finish the job? What we didn't count on, because we thought the IDF was as indestructible as the IDF itself thought it was that these fighters, who are clearly within their rights to attack an occupier who is not living up to his responsibilities under international law, nobody ever talks about that, or to attack an occupier who's kept them in an open-air concentration camp for a decade or two, and really intensified that atmosphere once Sharon pulled the IDF out and turned everything over to Netanyahu. And once my president, George W. Bush, in the Oval Office in 2004, looked at Sharon and said, "Over to you, buddy. Over to you." Sharon was like a deer caught in the headlights. "What do you mean, Mr. President?" "Well, nothing's worked. The peace process, the MEPP, the roadmap, all the things Colin talks about all the time, they haven't worked. So over to you. It's yours." And it's been theirs ever since. And they've been prosecuting it on a slow burner on the West Bank in the Golan, in East Jerusalem, and in Gaza. And this attack on October the 7th gave them, like 9/11 did us, carte blanche. And they've been doing it ever since. But they didn't count on being beaten. And right now, they are on the cusp of losing. And Hamas is on the cusp of winning. But the people paying the price for this Pyrrhic victory are all around dying, just as Patrick said, miserably so, absurdly so. It's like a theater of the absurd to watch this happening. And with the United States standing right by, because we are letting them do what we want them to do. I can't say that too many times. This is our policy, and they're executing it for us. They're our attack dog in the Levant. They're not acting because Trump was paid all this money by Miriam Adelson. That may be a transactional positive for Trump, but they're acting because we let them do it. We pay them, we arm them, we give them every capability that they have, and we let them do it because we want them to do it. And don't ask me why we feel that way. I have my own suspicions about it. It has everything to do with race. It has everything to do with Islam. It has everything to do with, we really hate all those Arabs and Persians, but we just can't come out and say it. And we'd like them all to destroy themselves, but we just can't come out and say it. And Trump has bought into that. I don't know if he knows he has, but he's bought into it. I thought he might change things a bit and we might have a different situation, but we don't. But as I said, we're looking at a situation where the IDF could collapse at almost any moment. And if it does, then this man who's in charge will open a new front with Iran, and we're in for everything. We'll have a new war, and I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out to be a regional conflict that turned out to marry itself up somehow with the conflict in Ukraine and wound up being a global conflict. That's the prospects that both of these theaters actually have, and you pull Iran into it, create a third theater, and you have the prospects much larger for a regional conflagration. And I just don't think that's going to be positive for anyone. And we have nuclear powers in there. We have a very unstable nuclear power in Israel, not an NPT member, not an additional protocol signatory, not a safeguards agreement signatory, a bastard case, really. And I fear far more the nuclear capabilities with regard to Jerusalem and Israel than I do with regard to Iran in every respect. So it's a dicey situation. In my mind, it might be an even more serious situation than Ukraine.
Ray, come right in.
Well, let me say that I subscribe to every comma, semicolon that both my colleagues have said, except for two words, in perpetuity. I think Larry used that in another connection. I mean, I may be closer to perpetuity than the others of you because you're younger. I was born before World War II. So I was aware as I grew older of the first genocide. I knew about it as a teen. I couldn't do anything because it was sort of over, but I said to myself, when I get big and something like this happens, I'm going to do something about it. And now I'm big and now I'm trying to do something about it. It's unconscionable. The people elected by our democracy would be enabling genocide. Now, let me just say that the reason I have this keffiyeh on is because I feel rather strongly about this, according to the following dictum from Bishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa. Now, decades ago, he visited Palestine, and he said apartheid there was far worse than what he had experienced in South Africa. Far worse. Now, that was before genocide. What he said was this: in such situations, it is not a moral choice to be neutral. To be neutral is to be on the side of the oppressor. I refuse to be on the side of the oppressor. And I think this is something one can be very angry and emotional about. I don't want my country doing this anymore. Now, what can we do? Well, the people always ask what we can do. You can do something. Aaron Bushnell, who we awarded the Sam Adams Award to last year, before he self-immolated, he said, "Look, I used to ask myself, what would I do if I was alive during slavery or during Jim Crow, or what would I do if people were being genocided?" And I said to myself, well, and I say to you now, you're doing it now. You're doing it or you're not doing it, okay? That's a challenge. Now, each of us has some ways to react here, get off our rear ends and do something. Several hundreds of my colleagues in Veterans for Peace are fasting on 250 calories a day, which is what the Gazans were subject to before the latest disruptions of aid supplies into Gaza. Before, okay, 250. I tried that one day. My son, the doctor, said, "No, Dad, I tried it one day and I was good for nothing by 4 o'clock in the afternoon." So that's going on. They're demonstrating in this hunger strike before the UN mission to the UN and in many other cities, okay? The other thing, well, there's a flotilla boat going to Gaza. It's about 5 days out. Good friend of mine, good friend of ours, Ann Wright, is on it. It's a multinational flotilla. It's a sailboat, great big sailboat. They're about to arrive off the Sinai or off Gaza on the 8th of June as I reconstruct their path. And I don't know if this was deliberate, but Larry and Patrick perhaps will remember what happened on the 8th of June, 1967, when the Israelis shot up the USS Liberty, killing 74 sailors and wounding 147 others, okay? So that's a strange coincidence. What will the Israelis do to that flotilla boat filled to the degree it can be filled? It's a small boat with provisions. It's a token access for aid to Gaza. I don't know. I know what happened when I did this in 2011, and that was that we were warned by the National Security Council and by the State Department that President Obama, for his election prospects, would just as soon want to have cold corpses come down off our boat, which was titled the U.S. Boat to Gaza, the Audacity of Hope, okay, and which we charted under U.S. law and everything. And we were ready to go. We did go out into the 9 miles out of the harbor in Piraeus, and then we found out that Obama had prevailed on the Greeks and their Coast Guard to turn us back. Why? Well, he said, look, you guys need an IMF loan, right? Forget about the loan unless you disallow that boat. We had lots of people on that boat, good people, return back. So at least we were spared being attacked as the Mavi Momoro was the year before, with 10 people killed, including a U.S. citizen. So what's going to happen to this Gaza flotilla? And if it happens, will it get any publicity? And you know what? The Israelis have to decide whether they're going to let these guys in or not. They probably won't. But these people are doing this act because it's good. The last thing I'll say is, people worry about results. Americans in particular, I'm not going to get involved in anything unless there's a reasonable prospect of success, right? Well, my friend Dan Berrigan and my tutor used to always say, look, the good is worth doing because it's good. Results are not unimportant, but they're secondary to the goodness of the act. So let's figure out some good, nonviolent act that each and every one of us can do to make sure our government knows that we're not about, as American citizens, to tolerate genocide, mass starvation, extermination of a whole people. I'm big now. I'm not going to sit still for it.
Yeah, Patrick, jump right in. There's this situation, as both Larry and Ray outlined, is not only dire, but it does have this regional character to it. And I'm curious about your evaluation of Trump's and the Trump administration's approach you've outlined its approach to Gaza, but then there's this larger picture too that, of course, extends right to Gaza. You have these talks with Iran, for example, that have just been head spinning in a lot of ways, because on the one hand you have talks about we're almost close to a deal together, and then you have on the other just these maximalist demands that come out. It seems like every other day, which seems to suggest that there is no movement there. And then it comes to question, well, what exactly is the movement around all of this really all about anyway? So, Patrick, your thoughts?
Yeah, good point to jump onto, Danny, because the Iran nuclear talks, as they're called, okay, they're set up to fail for a very similar reason that the Ukraine talks are dysfunctional and set up to fail. I'm talking from the U.S. Position, is that Donald Trump wants to do basically a carbon copy of the JCPOA, or maybe something a little extreme in terms of what enrichment levels are allowed with Iran. But he and his previous regime, led by Mike Pompeo, who was being prodded by Netanyahu to tear up the JCPOA, and they certainly did it a year into the first Trump term. What made that stick, that agreement, was the fact that it wasn't just the United States that negotiated it. It was the fact that this was the P5+1. You had all of these major stakeholders, Europe, Russia, all these people together can glue an agreement like that, okay, and almost make it so it's difficult because of a change in administration or government in any particular country that's going to deep six the agreement. That's how it was designed. That's why it took 2 years to put together. So think of all the capital, the U.S. political capital poured in there all the time, the sweat, the effort, Europe, the European Commission, different other parties that were involved in that. And Donald Trump tore it up unilaterally at the express request of Israel, okay? He himself probably didn't know why. He just said, at the time, Donald Trump's analysis was, it's a terrible deal. It's a terrible deal. What a terrible deal. It wasn't a terrible deal because he's trying to get he'd be lucky to get the exact same deal now. But it's going to fail because of that reason. You can't do this unilaterally. And the United States has proven to the Iranians, to the Russians, and to to people in Gaza, the Palestinians and Hamas and whoever, that they're not agreement capable. That they don't have either another administration comes in that could actually be more hawkish than, believe it or not, than the Trump administration, a neocon administration, if they followed this Trump administration. Then this deal, if Trump even signs or agrees on it, it's going to be in disarray. So where does that leave the Middle East security architecture? It leaves it in a place where there's a lot of potential. There's some good things that are happening in the Middle East. I think, but the good things that are happening are a result of bad things that have happened. And I'm talking about the way the region views Israel, the way the world views Israel, that you cannot kid yourself. There is no future for the state of Israel in its current form that they can just waltz into the future, having done what they have just done in the last 2 years. There is no future. They can't just pretend it didn't happen and wish it away. Israel is stuck in a terminal death spiral. They have to go for more war. They have to escalate more aggression with various and sundry neighbors, anybody that seems to oppose them or stand up for the human rights of the Palestinians, or they're going to collapse and fold. The regime will fold and collapse from within under the weight of its own moral hypocrisy and just outright criminal crimes against humanity. There's an ethical and a moral collapse in the state of Israel. And the United States is kind of not far behind it as their main backer. And so the U.S. legitimacy is being caught in the undertow globally of Israel, you see. So at some point, the powers that be, international finance, capital, the money in the Gulf, Israel is now becoming more of a liability for the region than they are an asset for Western empire, okay, which arguably that's what they were, the beachhead for Anglo-American and Western transnational financial interest for the longest time. But now that's changed. Now you can see the pivot in finance and capital, moving towards the Middle East, and the future doesn't have Israel in it in its current form as a war-making, genocidal, extreme ethno-nationalist regime. There's no future for it. It's played out its hand historically now. So the question is, what's going to happen in the near term? Is it going to drag with the United States, Iran into a conflict? I see great potential for a security architecture in the Middle East between Iran, the Gulf, Turkey, possibly Egypt, to somehow hem in Israel somehow. But what's going to happen, and this goes back to what Ray said, was what can we do? Well, what we can do in the U.S. internationally is have First Amendment freedom of speech and assembly and the right to boycott and to divest and to lobby for sanctions against this bad international actor. But the problem in America is the current administration, the Trump administration, is basically declared war on the First Amendment. It's declared war on freedom of assembly. Marco Rubio is spending more time chasing students in and around and out of the country than he is doing his job as Secretary of State. It's the most crazy Secretary of State I've ever seen in my life, okay? So that if those are the priorities, that's what Americans can do. That's what people internationally can boycott. South Africa, the apartheid regime in South Africa didn't fold voluntarily. They folded because of sanctions, because of international pressure. And the U.S. public can lead that. And they did do a huge amount to bring down the apartheid regime in South Africa. The U.S. population did, and as well as the European population. But this goes back to what Larry said about the lobby. Just last thing I'll say is just to expand on that one thing Mearsheimer and Waltz left out of their analysis is the fact that what that money buys isn't necessarily the president, but it's almost, in this case of Trump, it bought the approval, the short list of all his cabinet members that had anything to do with foreign policy or national security were okayed by Israel. And it wouldn't be the first time this happened for a U.S. cabinet. Obama, Wall Street provided their short list of cabinet appointees in 2008. And if you think about what happened immediately after in 2008 in the financial crash, the TARP, the bailout, that was hugely consequential. Same thing you could say with this Trump term. And this is a huge problem for the U.S. because while they might be good for Israel, all these people, Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, and whoever else, they're not necessarily good for the rest of the world. They'll do right for Israel, but they're going to fumble the ball on every other situation. So, and this is where the lobby becomes dangerous, more than just the perceived influence over the president, but handpicking all the members of his cabinet who formulate policy and who go and attack students. And a lot of those cases are going to win out in the Supreme Court because they're unconstitutional, or the federal courts. But it's created a chilling effect in America, and this is costing lives in Gaza, quite frankly.
Yeah, let's get final words from Colonel Wilkerson and then Ray. Colonel.
I want to go back to what Ray said about the boats. Conscience was attacked by a drone, and we were pretty sure that was Israel. And I'm really worried about this one because there's a sub in the Eastern Med right now, a very quiet sub, a diesel sub, one that Netanyahu took bribes from the Germans over. I'm told that's part of his case in the court if we ever get him there. But, a torpedo would be horrible, or worse, divers coming out and putting a limpet mine or something like that on it. But I don't, for a moment, put it beyond Israel to bring this boat down. If it does get within range, so to speak, of delivering its aid. And I think Greta Thunberg is on there too, along with Ann and others. Brave souls all. I agree with what Patrick was saying, but I think we're at a point, if you've seen Joseph Avazar, Avesar, 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 who is a Israeli citizen, a Jewish Israeli citizen, and who runs for a group of us every other Sunday a simulation, simulating a government over the two governments, over now the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and more or less a federal government that would have a constitution, would have elections and so forth. And I thought it was a real farce in the beginning, and I didn't really feel like I would participate in it, but I've been participating in it now almost 2 years. And Joseph was recently in Jaffa, did a lot of videos from Jaffa and on the beach in Gaza. And Joseph says things like, Jewish state is not good for Jews, which is a powerfully true statement. And Joseph is all over YouTube right now. Just click through it and look at all the things he's doing. Many of the videos he made were in Israel. He went to Ben Gurion's house, stood in front of his house and said, this is the first terrorist. This is the first terrorist. And then went through the history and did that throughout Jaffa. Went into Jaffa on the Sabbath and said, look, the train's not running. You know why the train's not running? Because they have this law that says on the Sabbath, you can't work. And so the trains can't work. But you know how they get around that? And then he described all the workarounds. And he said, look at the shops and everything. This is not a religious state. It's only a religious state for those ultra-Orthodox people. And that's part of the problem too. What do you think it's like out of the 100,000 that were drafted under the new law of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim? Only 10,000 reported for duty. But what do you think it's like incorporating those 10,000 into the ranks of the IDF now bloodied in Gaza? Is that helping morale? I'll bet it isn't. Back to my point that the IDF is falling apart and Israel is falling apart economically, financially, culturally, conscience-wise, psychologically, whatever term you want to use, it's falling apart. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that we will probably try to buttress it and hold it up because it is our attack dog in the Levant. And we're not about to turn to Saudi Arabia to do it or any other country in there, the GCC or whatever. We want Israel to do it. But I think Israel is, as Patrick just implied strongly, done, toast, put a fork in it. That's going to be traumatic for us. This administration possibly is going to be traumatic for. But then we've got the other issue. And the other issue is that when Bibi Netanyahu, and he is very good at smelling the winds, senses this existentially, he will go to war with Iran. And every expectation is that when he expands the conflict that way, we will be with him. Now, I know Donald Trump has publicly said if he starts the war, he's not going to be with him. But I dare say I don't believe him. We're going to be with him. And then I think all bets are off for that region of the world. We're going to have a real war. All to say that, as I said before, I think we're in a very dicey time here in a stretch of contingencies. The latest thing I heard about the negotiations, which was preposterous in my mind, was that Woodcock had said that we were going to get an agreement out of Archie and others who were involved in the negotiations. We were going to get an agreement that they would not enrich for 3 years. And we were going to cover over that with the, announcement that their enrichment was zero. There's no enrichment at all. And the details were going to be that they had agreed that they wouldn't do it for 3 years, but we would make that very public. And then they'd go back to doing the 3.67 or 3.7 or whatever and get their other uranium that was a little more highly enriched from other countries as they did under the JCPOA. I don't think that's right. I don't think the Iranians are going to accept that at all. I think they've put too much blood and too much treasure into this program, and they're not going to surrender it even for 3 years of lying and cheating and stealing. So we're headed for another one there, I think. Another one that will be accompanied by the state of Israel being kaput. I'm not sanguine about that place either. Hate to be such a pessimist, but.
Ray.
Well, I'd like to quote Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who was a real justice person, especially during Vietnam and even later. What he said was this: when people do evil, there are lots that are involved. If we're not doing the evil, can't blame us. We're not accountable, so to speak. Well, that's wrong. We are. We're accountable and we're responsible for stopping it, because doing nothing in the face of evil is worse than doing the evil itself. So, are we sitting around condoning or not holding our own people accountable for this? I dare say many of us are. We have to stop that. We have to respond to this dictum that says, look, you can't be neutral. You can't be just a bystander. In other words, when this kind of evil is going on, because that's worse than doing the evil yourself, says Heschel. I have one little question I want to ask Larry. It's about
There's
the
Martin Luther
Iranian.
King and a host of other people too.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for adding that. Larry and Patrick have been following this very closely. Again, I may be too relaxed about Iran and Netanyahu, but it would be such a cataclysm if Netanyahu did, in the last analysis, what Larry just suggested, and expected us to join him. And my question is this: are there enough compos mentis admirals and generals in our armed forces to go to Trump now and say, look, we think, at least Larry Wilkerson thinks, and others of high repute think, that if Netanyahu starts a war with Iran, you will have no choice other than to join in. Just let us explain to you what's going to happen then, okay? Look, Israel's going to be destroyed, and we're going to lose all those bases around the periphery, okay? So do you really want that? Okay. My question is this: aren't our military telling Trump that? And isn't that one reason why I can be more relaxed than many others in thinking, well, that's why Trump has publicly warned Netanyahu, and in the final analysis, maybe Netanyahu won't go that far. I don't know. You guys probably know more than I do.
My answer to that question, Ray, was they were, but I'm not sure anymore, because a lot of those theys are gone.
You mean the general officers?
Not just the generals. More importantly, the colonels telling the generals.
Ouch.
Patrick, any? I'm sorry if there was a question too, but we also can just close here.
Yeah, some of the people, the talking heads, Admiral James Stavridis and others, they all seem to be very pro-war, just pretty much across the board. So yeah, I don't see that high-ranking former, advisors and heads of NATO and so forth stepping forward, unfortunately. But we do see a lot of other people, especially in our media space, like Colonel Danny Davis, and of course Present Company as well, that seem to be giving sober advice and analysis on this. So, and certain people in the administration are listening and do watch these podcasts, which is good. And some of these ideas filter up. The question is, do they stick? And how well are they getting through? So, like, permanently changing thinking and so forth. So I hope so. So, like what Ray said, is something to be hoped for. Is that the sea change in the media, that some of the foreign policy discussions and things like on these big issues on the independent media space, and Judge Napolitano and people like this making a massive impact in changing public opinion, especially within academia and within think tank world. It's creating a consensus, and that consensus moves like an elephant. It's very slow, but it does move, and not fast enough, of course, for the people who are under threat. But it is happening, and that's, hopefully we're in a little bit of a race of time there.
Well, gentlemen, it was great to have all three of you on stream today. We can close here. Everyone, as you leave, be sure to hit the like button. That helps continue this stream on into YouTube's algorithm. You can go to the video description to find 21st Century Wire. You can find that website below. I don't know if there's anything else anyone wanted to put out there, Ray or Colonel Wilkerson, you wanted to share. But if not, we can head out.
Well, let me just say that my webmeister is my son, and he criticizes me very strongly if I don't mention that he puts things up on my website, which is called raymcgovern.com. Not hard to remember, all one word. And I also do a lot of tweeting on X, and that's at Ray McGovern.
All right. Well, I'm getting that in the video description now. Without further ado, everyone, you can go to the video description too to find all the places to support this channel, Patreon, Substack, and so many other options. I want to apologize if anyone asked a question in the super chats. We just don't have time today to get to them. I think there was just one, but I want to really say thank you to everyone who gave a super chat as well. Without further ado, everybody, have a good rest of your day, evening, wherever you are, and we'll be back again soon.
Mm-hmm.